think it's important to think about content prioritization because you don't need the same level of quality for every single piece of content.
Hello and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, translation, and global communication. I'm Caterina from Anderto, and I'm glad to have you back in the second installment of our conversation with Miguel Sepulveda. Today we are tackling the big elephant in the room, ROI in localization. Miguel shares valuable insights of measuring success, tapping into his huge impact in the localization industry. If you missed the first part of the chat, just go back, check the previous episode. But for now, let's jump in.
Hi, Miguel. Welcome back. And we're going to be here going up a little bit more in, let's say, in the nitty-gritty, especially talking about ROI. So how do you calculate the ROI of localization? Or how would you go about that?
If that's the point, that's a good clarification. That's the elephant in the room. I've lost count of how many times I've been asked about the ROI of localization. And the truth is that quantifying the return of investment, ROI of localization, it can be complex, even if I doubt that it's possible, because it may be challenging to measure and demonstrate the direct impact of localization on key performance indicators such as revenue growth and customer satisfaction, because isolating the impact is tricky in the sense that a good user experience doesn't just rely on excellent action. So most users, when using a product, want to stop and say, wow, this translation is great. That may only be noticed by us, nerds working on this field. But for most people, the user experience comes from having good levels of quality overall. And that means like no functional bugs, intuitive design, appealing graphics, pleasing music if that's the case, and appropriate translation. So what we do is just one piece of creating that great user experience. Furthermore, let's imagine the following. If I have a product with excellent localization, but with many functional errors, the sale of that product might be poor. And does that mean the ROI of localization is bad? Or does it mean the product is poorly developed? And that's why I believe that is isolating the impact of localization is complex. And I do not encourage localization teams to fall into that rabbit hole, because localization contributes to revenue, expand global reach, and it's of course an important piece. But ultimately, the excellence of product comes from each function performing well. So another analogy I like to bring to these conversations when I'm having these conversations, which is often, is to put things into perspective. And I don't usually hear developers that they are requesting or trying to prove the ROI of their code, or an audio team justifying their return of investment of a melody that they compose for an app, or a human resources, or that they are thinking about the return of investment. So therefore, I consider measuring the impact of localization in terms of return of investment is not the best approach, in my opinion. I think that it's a better way to think about which are the metrics that are affected, that localization influence, and that will go to everything related with customer experience, customer engagement, and all that, rather than saying you invest this amount of money and you are going to get return, because that's very difficult to prove. And I'm not even sure if that's the right conversation. I think this is a problem we are inheriting from marketing teams in the past, that you have one marketing campaign and you have, $1 million and you're expecting to get this amount of money. But for us, it's not like that, because we are one component of many components. If the product is bad, the session cannot make a miracle. And the other way around, the feedback you get maybe is not clear that is because of localization. So I think it's a way better conversation to think about metrics that localization influence, instead of thinking I invested, I'm going to get that that would be too easy. And there are many layers. I mean, language is culture. You cannot really get the return of investment of a culture. There is a component there that it's impossible to measure, in my opinion. The only way that I have managed to do that in my career is when you are able to do an A/B test, where basically you have one product and you don't have that product localized in this market. And then you localize the product and you measure for a number of days, weeks, months, the metrics you are getting there. But it has to be exactly the same functionality, because in the moment that you are making some tweaks, then you may be contaminating the metrics you are getting. But if you have exactly the same product, like a web page that you the first in 5 countries, and then you go to another 5, and you start monitoring before you do the localization, and then you do exactly the same functionality, exactly the same layout, design exactly the same, but it's just that it's localized. Then, yes, that's a very valid metric that you can see which are the differences that you have in different indicators. It's the only way that is really scientific and mathematically correct to do this kind of A/B test. If it's not an A/B test, it's just guessing. It's just a hypothesis, because there are multiple things that could make a product succeed or not. And isolated the impact of localization in that is extremely, extremely difficult.
And when you mentioned to look at the metrics that localization impact as an impact on influence, can you give some example, go more in detail? What kind of metrics maybe it's more useful to look at?
That will be, for example, customer engagement metrics. So you can have your dashboards where you are reviewing metrics such as website traffic, time spent on a site, click-through rates, bounce rates. So with all that, you can assess the impact of localization, and particularly if you have this before and after, that's ideal. But basically, you can have your dashboards with all these metrics per market. And then you can see if you are localizing a new campaign or a new functionality, if any of these metrics, if it's changing. That's very common in mobile, because in mobile you gather a lot of data from our devices. We are giving data continuously to companies. So you can geo-target every single data, and then you need to break down that per market and get some information. So those are metrics that are interesting to see. You can also go with metrics related with customer satisfaction. And then you could have this net promoter score, where you can have this score for the different markets. Another possibility is the customer feedback, customer review, testimonials, where you are getting the impact of localization on customer satisfaction and loyalty. And you can compare the satisfaction level of localized customers with non-localized customers. And you can try to make a hypothesis there that you are having an impact. You can also think about the landing page in some web pages. If you are seeing that you have an English page, people leave the page soon. Maybe it's because they don't understand what they are reading. So something that you can do is you localize one part of it and you see if that's making people stay longer with your product. And then you have a hypothesis that, of course, you will have to validate, right? But that might be an indicator to see, okay, now this landing page, people understanding, they are spending time here. The same you can do with tutorials in video games or in apps. You can see if when you are localizing tutorials, that means that people are understanding better what they need to do. And that also could help to be longer in the platform. So all those metrics are important because they have this relationship with language, but they are not getting this simple formula or I invest this, I will get that, because it's around getting more into users' behaviors and human behaviors. So that's why measuring just in economical budget is so difficult unless you do an A/B test.
And connected to that, actually, yeah, I see that what you mean is, again, connected to what you mentioned before about the starting small and then growing bigger. So start small, test it out, see how it works, how it improves, and then maybe make a case to expand the effort. Yeah, that makes sense. And do you have, like, in general, any recommendation, like how can companies, when they look at localization, basically to get the most out of the budget. And it's just like how to, because like, yeah, as we talked before, it doesn't make sense that maybe to go into 20 markets all at once. It's better to maybe have a better focus. Like any recommendation you will have on how to adjust that focus so it's like the most effective, how you can identify the most effective way to enter markets.
So on top of what we talk about starting small and grow gradually, I think it's important to think about content prioritization, because you don't need the same level of quality for every single piece of content. So probably the marketing content, you want your best effort and all the money that you can invest there, because that's going to be very visible. But then when it comes to reference material, for example, that you could be okay with machine translation and some post-edit, because that's more like a kind of technical documentation that is less creative compared to marketing. Probably you want to go with real experts in one field while relying on automation in another one. So that's something that is important, to take the time to break down all the type of content you have, like the documentation, the marketing, the social media, the customer support, the in-app, in-game, in-software content. So making like different and make like a matrix with a level of visibility of that type of content. And also thinking with you is like, if I make a mistake or if I need to reduce budget, in these categories, where is the lower risk? Because that's going to give you a way to prioritize your budget. But yeah, usually I see the same thing, that we go with the same strategy with every piece of content, regardless of the visibility or the importance. And it's good to take the time when you're preparing your localization strategy to think about the visibility, the reachability, and then based on that, you map your budget with that visibility. So that's something that usually works very well, because we don't need to have excellence in every piece. Another area that's also related with prioritization, but not for content, but for markets, it's that not all the markets, they have the same expectations for quality. We know that Japan is a very demanding market. It's very demanding. So perhaps you need to pay more attention in that market compared to Spain, that it can be more tolerable not to having a perfect product. But for them, perfection is expected. And that's going to be the same in different markets. So you need to understand also the markets you are operating. And again, put the money in those ones that they are really valuing the quality and that they are expecting very high quality in every single piece that they are interacting. So yeah, I think that what we talked earlier around adding complexity as we evolve, and also take the time to analyze the visibility of the content, take the time to understand which are your more demanding markets. Those are three ideas that I believe that everyone should include in a localization strategy to make the most of the budgets.
And is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you think will be worth like discussing or mentioning?
This part that we talk briefly about how to adapt the content. By content, I mean the code. That's also interesting. So that's what we call, as you know, internationalization, but it's all about global readiness. And it's all about trying to understand what makes a digital product world ready. If it's not from day one, at least before you go to the next phase. So it's important to understand when you look at the code of one app, and that's usually the role of either developers or localization engineers at the vendor side, or similar roles that there may be solutions architects. It's all around understanding what makes a digital product world ready. And then there are many things that they are important to consider, because there is where you need to start talking. First, you need to review all the content you are getting, and then you need to start educating your stakeholders in areas such as don't concatenate the strings, because that's something that is very common for developers to do that. It's not a good idea to concatenate the strings. So that's something that you need to review. The use of placeholders, that's something also that is important to review, because English, for example, it's an easy language in the sense that you don't have so many genders, but then in other languages, you have more than two, and you have also masculine, feminine, neutral. So in many cases, English developers, they don't think about this masculine, feminine, neutral, and they start using placeholders that then for the translators, they cannot really fit it because they would need like different placeholders for the different genders, and then the code is not really well prepared. So that's something that is important to pay attention. Hard coding text in keys, that's also something that I've seen very often, that the developers, they are creating the code and then they put directly the text there in English, and that's horrible then for translators because you cannot really extract that. So explaining them that is not a good idea to hardcore text, that's also important. There are all these things that you need to take into consideration about UI. English is shorter, and then they are going to require less space in the user interfaces. When you are localizing into Brazilian, you might have like 30-40% more length than in English. That's particularly problematic in mobile phones because in a computer, okay, maybe. But in mobile phones, it is what it is. So that's why we see so many truncation. But that's a problem of not thinking about global readiness from day one. And that may be also actually related with what I mentioned earlier about being involved in aviation. Because if we are thinking about markets, I'm thinking about Brazil that I just mentioned. Brazil, it's a market with a high penetration of mobile. And that's the device that many people use. And they're not really using computers. So that's like their computer. Then if you are developing your software and you are not considering that it's going to take longer, you are going to have many truncation, and that's going to impact the perception of quality. So in this internationalization phase, in this global readiness phase, it's interesting to think about text expansion. It's also interesting to think about inclusive writing at that phase, because you are going to review that. You should try to think if there's any kind of bias towards gender in what you are reviewing before even starting localization. So yeah, there are a few things that localization professionals need to pay attention and break down into what are the different requirements that they are needed to make a digital product worldwide ready. And a big part of this work is explain, because it's all about, that's something that I learned actually in the localization world that I like it about one session that I attended, is that when working with developers, you tell them this internationalization best practice, you present them as requirements. It's not a best practice. It's a requirement to be global ready. So it's a requirement that they need to have room for text expansion. It's a requirement that they need to pay attention to payment methods. It's a requirement that they cannot hard code line breaks, placeholders. So you need to have that checklist. You need to communicate that checklist. You need to audit that checklist. And then you are starting in a good place, the localization. So yeah, a few things to consider.
Yeah, it might sound like a tall order, but actually it makes sense to do it before, as soon as possible, because otherwise you're gonna, the same problem across different markets. That's definitely gonna be worse.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's why when we are doing localization QA, you often see the same bug in all the languages. And when you are working with a vendor and they are sending you that this is happening in all the languages, is like, oh my God, it would have been so much efficient that we fix that left and that we fix this in this internationalization global readiness space, because now we just introduce the problem in X times. And now we have a tester reporting this in every single language that we need to fix in every single language, and that we need to test in every single language. So that's a waste of time of everyone. So that's why, as you are saying, the international, it's important to do it at the right time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think our time is up for today, but thank you so much for being here, joining us, and super useful. I'm sure like a lot of insights.
Thank you. I'm happy. I think that we need to communicate this to the world. So happy to have this space and opportunity to discuss this with you.
Thank you, Miguel. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help companies translate their content into results. Get in touch if you want to know more. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. See you next time.